Hi, welcome to Explorations in Economic History and Thought. And today we're going to be talking about the fall of the new economic policy, and in particular NEP in crisis due to the economic calculation problem, a crisis in prices. One of the crises that occurred during the new economic policy period that related to pricing was called the scissors crisis. And it was called this because, like the blades of an open pair of scissors, the prices between agricultural goods and industrial goods were diverging. They actually reached a peak in 1923, but they continued to cause problems after that. And the big problem with this was that farmers were only able to get a very low amount for their grain when they sold it on the open market, and there were still open markets for grain. But when they went to buy things like tractors, the industrial goods prices were so high that they were unable to buy them, and they were unwilling to even sell their grain because they were unable to buy what they needed with the money. So they actually withheld their grain a lot of times as well. So by 1923, industrial prices were 290% of their 1913 levels, and agricultural prices had fallen to only 89% of their 1913 levels. So the peasants began to stop selling their produce and revert to subsistence farming, and, because they didn't even have tractors and so on, to produce a lot of excess grain to sell in the market. And so this began to lead to fears of a famine. What caused this crisis? Well, the state industrial syndicates and factories and so forth demanded high prices for manufactured goods, which the farmers needed, and over which the state exercised near monopolistic control. And the state was also the principal purchaser of bread grain, and they bought it at very low prices. So even though the farmers were private, the state pretty much set the prices for that, or during different periods actually outright set it, but they were the main purchaser in any case, and they were only willing to pay low prices. In response to the scissors crisis, Bukharin introduced a plan of rationalization of the economy. And rationalization took the form of a set of price controls. NEP allowed for private ownership and trade, but also price controls on many goods. So when price controls on wholesale goods, including industrial farm machinery, led to shortage, and the retail prices rose. So the Soviet government blamed it on speculation in the industrial goods market, for example, and they didn't blame it. They didn't blame the shortage on policy. So in response to escalating retail prices, the Soviet government took over the industrial goods market, setting both wholesale and retail prices for industrial goods. And although the terms of trade for farmers were improved by letter of law, this led to a shortage of industrial goods in the countryside because industrial goods prices were fixed so low. So although speculation may have been an approximate cause, the market forces that drove the prices up were based on the real factor of shortage due to the price ceiling. So seeing that the peasants were not able to purchase the equipment they needed because of this shortage, and wanting to keep on good terms with the peasants, industrial goods prices were further reduced, leading to, of course, even greater shortage. And occasionally grain prices were increased, but this also had consequences. So when price controls led to even greater shortage, the Soviet leaders didn't make the connection still, and they tended to exacerbate it. So in addition to the main problem of industrial goods shortage due to the scissors problem and the ineffective use of price controls there was also a problem with the relative prices of food crops and industrial crops. So the price of food crops and industrial crops led to a shortage and surplus of the two. The relative prices were difficult to correct. As Bolshevik leaders tried to juggle the different relative prices, each caused an imbalance in other areas. The relative prices between agriculture and manufacturing was only one market that the Soviet government had to keep in balance. Another was between private and public farming. the Soviet government couldn't effectively control the price of agricultural goods. Private grain prices rose due to the market response of responding to shortage, but state and collective farm prices were fixed, leading those farms to take out loans, which then resulted in inflationary policy and higher grain prices in the private sector. The response by Soviet leaders was to try to take over more and more control. If the government was the producer, it could increase output and prevent shortage. So as Soviet leaders attempted to set their prices that would allow industrialization to occur without harming the peasant, they took more and more and more control over manufacturing. Unfortunately, when they lowered industrial prices to allow the peasant to purchase tractors and other goods, the result was shortage in the countryside and ailing state-owned businesses in the city. But when the prices given to peasants were too low, instead, there were grain crises, which could lead to famine. So many Soviet leaders felt that the only way to resolve the problem without eliminating price controls would be for the state to take over production of industrial goods completely. If the government was the producer, it could increase output and prevent the shortage. This was the argument of the left, which finally became state policy when Stalin won power. This crisis is well examined in several books and also in the Macroeconomics of NEP from the journal Economic History Review. The state kept taking over more and more of the industrial manufacturing sector, so that by 1927, only 6% was still privately owned of wholesale trade turnover, whereas in 1922, 75% of it had been private. And by 1927, things like Article 107, the Exceptional Measures article, was used in order to be able to control prices by nationalizing more and more of the industry. And the other thing, in addition to trying to control prices, Bukharin spoke of controlling trade as a weapon for, quote, our struggle with the exploiting elements in the countryside, which meant, of course, the rich peasants, which they called kulaks. Because industry was almost completely nationalized, and given the problems in the supply chain and in transportation in these nationalized industries, any increase in the people's purchasing power led to a greater shortage of machinery and manufactured goods. Because, again, with the nationalization, there was no market response when people had greater purchasing power. They couldn't respond by expanding their production. And of course, the state had taken over complete control rather than just using price controls, because they did intend to increase in response to greater purchasing power, increase the production. But they had these problems with the supply chain and with the transportation in the nationalized industries. In their attempts to plan, in their attempts to be responsive, they kept running into problems, and we'll talk about some of these supply chain problems and transportation problems, but these are the kind of price problems that happened under complete nationalization. But so as the purchasing power would increase, when they, for example, increased the price of grain paid to the peasants, it would simply result in greater shortage in the industrialized sectors. So in February 1927, the Party Central Committee ordered that the retail prices of industrial consumer goods be reduced, and from August onwards there were serious shortages. And in order to avert another grain crisis in 1927, given the higher price that the peasants could obtain for meat, which was still sold in free markets, the state would have to substantially increase the price again, and the Soviet leaders chose not to do this. So industrialization was too high a priority, and they weren't willing to privatize again what they had nationalized. So instead, they resorted to using exceptional measures, including grain seizure and including forced nationalizations. And this signaled the beginning of the end of NEP, according to most historians.